Snow fell like ash over the silent city. It was January 1942, and Leningrad had become a frozen tomb. The wind howled through empty streets, carrying with it the faint creak of doors that no longer led to life. Every building bore scars, shattered windows, blackened walls, the jagged wounds of artillery shells. In the dim light of a dying day, figures moved slowly through the snow, wrapped in rags and layers of old clothing, their faces hollow and gray. They no longer looked like the proud citizens of a once great city. They looked like ghosts. The siege had stripped everything away: warmth, food, safety. But it had not yet stolen the will to live. That will flickered in every heart like a weak, defiant flame that refused to go out. In one apartment on Nevsky Prospect, a woman named Anna sat beside the frozen body of her husband. He had died 3 days ago, but she had not found the strength to drag him to the street. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful, as if asleep. Anna had once been a teacher. Now she could barely remember the sound of her own voice in a warm classroom. Her daughter Katya sat on the floor, silent, tracing shapes in the frost that crept across the window. The radio in the corner played faint static, then a voice, a deep, calm tone that belonged to a man named Levitan, the voice of Soviet hope. "Leningrad stands," he said. "The city fights on." Anna closed her eyes. Outside, artillery thundered again, and the room trembled, but the words stayed with her. Leningrad stands. Somehow, that mattered. Every morning, the city woke not to life, but to survival. People queued in endless lines before bakeries that had long since run out of bread. They waited in silence, hoping that maybe, just maybe, a truck would arrive with rations. When it did, each person received a small slice of dark, heavy bread that weighed 125 grams. That was a day's ration, the only thing standing between life and starvation. It was not really bread anymore. It was made from sawdust, cellulose, and anything else the bakers could find. People still kissed it before eating, whispering thanks. In that gesture was a kind of faith that the next day would come. By night, the bombers returned. The German aircraft droned overhead like locusts, their engines echoing off the Neva River. Anti-aircraft guns roared, and searchlights swept the clouds. The city glowed faintly with fire as oil tanks burned on the outskirts. Yet even under bombardment, people refused to abandon their posts. Firefighters dug through rubble to save what little was left. Doctors performed surgeries in candlelight, their breath fogging the cold air. Musicians, those who could still hold their instruments, rehearsed Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony. They played with trembling fingers, some collapsing mid-rehearsal, too weak to continue. When the symphony was finally performed and broadcast by loudspeakers across the front, the Germans heard it too. They listened, stunned, as the music of defiance rolled across the battlefield. One German officer later said it sounded like a city that will never surrender. On the ice of Lake Ladoga, a lifeline began to form. The road of life. Trucks crept across the frozen lake under the cover of night, their engines muffled, their headlights covered. Each carried food, medicine, and ammunition. The drivers were young and terrified, but they went anyway. Some never made it. The ice cracked. The trucks vanished into black water. Those who survived returned with refugees: women, children, the wounded. The lake claimed many, but it also saved hundreds of thousands. Without that fragile route, Leningrad would have starved to death entirely. In the factories, workers continued to produce shells and rifles, even as they fainted from hunger. They wrapped rags around their hands to keep them from freezing to the metal tools. The city's defense depended on them, and they knew it. When a worker died at their station, someone else quietly took their place. The war did not stop for grief. In those moments, the human spirit reached a strange kind of purity. When everything else was gone, duty remained. Spring came slowly. The snow melted into filthy rivers that carried away the dead. Gardens began to sprout in the ruins, tiny patches of green between craters and rubble. People planted potatoes in the courtyards of bombed-out buildings. Soldiers on the front shared their rations with children who still played among the ruins, laughing faintly, as if laughter itself was an act of rebellion. The city's pulse grew stronger again, though it beat weakly. Life clung to every crack and corner. By 1943, the Red Army began to push back. The blockade was still tight, but cracks were forming in the German lines. Soviet artillery on the eastern bank of the Neva fired day and night, pounding enemy positions. Soldiers wrote home, telling their families to hold on just a little longer. In January 1943, after 500 days of hunger and death, the siege was partially broken. Supply routes reopened, bringing real bread for the first time in months. People wept in the streets as they held warm loaves in their hands. They had survived the unthinkable. Yet the city was not free. The siege would continue for another full year. Bombings persisted, and winter returned with its familiar cruelty. But now, Leningrad had hope. The people who had once whispered prayers in the dark now sang again. They rebuilt what they could, mended broken windows, lit candles in the ruins of churches. Even the bells began to ring once more, a sound thought lost to the war. The Germans could still see the city through their binoculars, but what they saw now was something indestructible. When the siege finally ended in January 1944, the city was unrecognizable. Over 1 million people were dead. Streets were lined with graves, buildings reduced to hollow shells. But those who remained stood taller than any army. They had endured starvation, bombardment, and despair. And they had won. As Soviet troops entered the city, tears and applause filled the air. No one had the strength to cheer loudly, but every heart roared with pride. Leningrad had not fallen. It had survived 900 days of hell, and it still stood. In the years that followed, the survivors rarely spoke of what they had seen. The memories were too heavy, too painful, but they carried them silently, passing them to their children and grandchildren. The city rebuilt, brick by brick, though the scars never faded. On cold mornings, when the wind blew through the streets, some claimed they could still hear faint echoes of that terrible winter, the creak of sleds carrying the dead, the murmur of the starving in the bread lines, the distant sound of Shostakovich's symphony drifting across the frozen river. The Siege of Leningrad was not just a story of suffering. It was a story of human endurance pushed to its absolute limit. It showed that courage is not always loud. It is sometimes as small as a mother breaking her bread in half, a musician playing through hunger, or a child smiling at the sunrise after 900 nights of darkness. The world would remember it as one of the darkest chapters in history, but also one of the brightest testaments to the strength of the human spirit. The people of Leningrad had lived through the unthinkable, and somehow they had not only survived, but triumphed. Their city stood as proof that even in the face of starvation, fire, and death, there are things that cannot be destroyed: hope, music, love, and the unyielding will to live. When the guns finally fell silent and the last shell burst over the Neva, the city exhaled for the first time in nearly 3 years. The soldiers on the front wept openly, their rifles trembling in their frost-bitten hands. Nurses in field hospitals collapsed, not from wounds this time, but from relief. Church bells that had not rung since 1941 began to toll, weakly at first, their cracked metal voices echoing through the ruins. The sound carried through the broken streets, over the frozen canals, and across the half-buried graveyards that had become part of Leningrad itself. For a moment, the city seemed to hold its breath in reverence for its dead. The survivors emerged slowly from cellars and ruined apartments. They were thin, pale, and wrapped in layers of tattered clothing, their eyes sunken but bright. Some walked with canes made from broken furniture. Others carried buckets to fetch water from the holes cut through the ice of the Neva. It was hard to believe these people had endured 900 days of siege. They looked fragile, but they were alive. And that fact alone was victory. Snow still covered the city, but the white seemed less cruel now, almost like a shroud being lifted. Anna, who had lost her husband and nearly her own hope, stood with her daughter Katya outside their apartment building. The windows were gone, the roof half collapsed, but sunlight touched the walls for the first time in weeks. Katya's small hand was cold in hers. They didn't speak. They just watched as soldiers marched by, waving red flags, their boots crunching through the snow. One of them stopped, smiled, and handed Katya a small piece of chocolate. A rarity beyond imagination. The girl stared at it as though it were treasure. She broke it in half and gave one piece to her mother. Anna cried for the first time since her husband's death. All across Leningrad, moments like that unfolded quietly. Families reunited, some discovering their loved ones were gone forever, others finding the impossible. The living faces they had long buried in their minds. People hugged strangers, shared meager food, and wept together. Death had been their constant companion for nearly 3 years. Now life, fragile and uncertain, began to return. The work of rebuilding started almost immediately. The government sent teams of engineers, soldiers, and workers to clear the streets. Children joined in, carrying small buckets of rubble, their laughter faint but real. Factories, once silent and buried under snow, roared back to life. The Kirov plant, which had produced tanks even under bombardment, became a symbol of defiance and rebirth. Within months, power stations were repaired, tram lines reopened, and schools resumed classes, even if the classrooms had no glass in the windows and no heat in the radiators. But rebuilding was not only about bricks and mortar, it was about memory, and memory was heavier than any stone. There were graves everywhere, beneath courtyards, under playgrounds, along the frozen riverbanks. Some marked with wooden crosses, many unmarked entirely. Every citizen carried a cemetery inside them. Mothers who had buried their children, children who had buried their parents, friends who had shared the last piece of bread. The city decided not to hide its pain. Instead, it built monuments. In the years that followed, Leningrad became a living memorial to endurance. The Piskaryovskoye Cemetery, stretching endlessly beneath gray skies, held the bodies of nearly 500,000 people. At its entrance, an inscription was carved in stone. No one is forgotten. Nothing is forgotten. Visitors came in silence, laying flowers and whispering prayers. Some cried. Others simply stood still, unable to find words for what they had survived. Life returned, but it was never the same. The people of Leningrad smiled again, but their smiles carried shadows. Hunger had left its mark, not just on their bodies, but on their hearts. Even years after the siege, survivors would hoard bread crusts, afraid of famine's ghost. The sound of distant thunder could make them flinch, mistaking it for shell fire. Yet, despite the trauma, there was pride, a deep, unshakable pride in what they had endured. They had not surrendered. They had not broken. They had lived. Katya grew up in the reborn city. She studied literature at the university, determined to tell the story of what her people had endured. She often visited the old apartment where she and her mother had survived the winter of 1942. The walls were still scarred, but she refused to have them repaired. "They are part of our history," she would tell her students. "You cannot erase pain. You must remember it." In 1964, on the 20th anniversary of the siege's end, the city held a massive commemoration. Veterans stood in rows, medals glittering against their worn coats. Music played, Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony again, the same that had once echoed through the city under siege. As the notes filled the air, many closed their eyes. For a moment, time folded. They were back in that winter again, hungry and afraid, listening to the symphony as bombs fell outside. But now, the music was no longer defiance. It was triumph. Decades passed, and the world changed. The Soviet Union fell and Leningrad became St. Petersburg once more. But the memory of the siege remained. On cold January mornings, old survivors would gather near the monuments with flowers and candles. Their numbers grew smaller each year, yet their voices remained steady. They spoke not of revenge or bitterness, but of endurance, of unity, of the human will that refuses to die even when everything else is lost. The story of the 900-day siege was never just about one city. It was about the capacity of people to endure the unimaginable. It was about what it means to hold on to humanity when the world collapses around you. In every act of kindness during those years, in every shared crust of bread, every whispered lullaby in the dark, every note of Shostakovich's music, there lived a quiet, stubborn form of resistance stronger than any army. And so, when snow falls again over St. Petersburg and the city lights shimmer on the frozen Neva, it feels as though the ghosts of those who endured are still there, watching, remembering, whispering to the living. We stood, and so must you. Years turned into decades, and the survivors of the siege grew old. Their hair turned silver, their hands trembled, and their steps slowed. But their memories remained vivid, as sharp as the winter wind that had once cut through the broken streets of their youth. Every January, on the day the siege was lifted, they gathered by the eternal flame at the Piskaryovskoye cemetery. They came wrapped in thick coats, clutching flowers, the snow crunching under their boots. Children and grandchildren stood beside them, listening quietly as the old ones spoke in voices soft but unwavering. Each story was different, yet all carried the same thread: suffering, endurance, hope. One man spoke of carrying his dead brother through the snow to the common grave, his tears freezing on his cheeks before they could fall. A woman told of a single potato shared among 5 people, and how its memory never left her. Another recalled how she had hidden her mother's ration card inside her coat, terrified that thieves might steal it while she slept. These were not tales told for pity or pride. They were offerings to memory itself, proof that the city's soul had not been extinguished. Katya, now an old woman herself, attended the commemorations each year. Her students often accompanied her, wide-eyed and silent, as she stood before the graves. "They say history repeats itself," she would tell them, her voice carried by the cold wind. "But it doesn't have to. That's why we remember, not to dwell on pain, but to prevent its return." She would then place her flowers among the thousands already laid there and close her eyes, whispering a prayer for her mother, for her father, and for all who had perished unseen. As St. Petersburg modernized, new buildings rose over old foundations. Glass towers reflected the river where wooden bridges had once stood. Tourists flooded the city, marveling at its beauty. The cathedrals, the palaces, the broad avenues. But few could imagine the horrors that had once consumed these same streets. Only the locals, especially the elders, felt the weight of ghosts beneath their feet. Some still avoided certain districts, knowing they had been mass burial grounds. Others still kept a candle burning in their windows during winter nights, a silent tribute to those who never saw the dawn. In museums and archives, the siege was documented meticulously. Diaries of ordinary citizens were preserved. Children's notebooks filled with trembling handwriting, ration cards, faded photographs, and letters written to loved ones who never returned. Scholars studied them. Filmmakers retold their stories. But even the most powerful words and images could never fully capture the rawness of living through those 900 days. The truth of the siege lived not in books, but in the quiet dignity of those who survived it. By the time the last survivors passed away, the city had changed beyond recognition. But the memory of the siege remained a living thing, woven into the stones, the river, the music. School children still visited the memorials, laying red carnations at the graves. They listened to recordings of the Seventh Symphony, and imagined a time when those same notes had risen through smoke and snow. Teachers told them how their city had stood alone, encircled, starving, but never surrendering. It was no longer just a lesson about war. It was a lesson about what it means to be human. Far beyond Russia, historians and writers would come to see the Siege of Leningrad as one of the greatest tests of endurance in history. While other cities had fallen or been abandoned, Leningrad endured the impossible: starvation, bombardment, and isolation. It was a story of tragedy, but also of strength. Western journalists who visited in later years wrote that the city's endurance symbolized not only Soviet resilience, but the universal human spirit, the will to live, to resist despair, to find meaning even in suffering. To find meaning even in suffering. In the end, what the siege revealed was something timeless, that survival is not just the absence of death, but the persistence of hope. The people of Leningrad did not survive by strength alone. They survived because they refused to stop believing in tomorrow. Even as bombs fell and the air froze in their lungs, they painted, they wrote, they played music, they dreamed. They clung to humanity like a flame in the dark. Today, when the wind blows over the Neva and snow settles on the silent monuments, you can almost hear their voices. They whisper through the birch trees across the frozen ground. We endured. We believed. We lived. And in that whisper lies the legacy of Leningrad. A story not of death, but of unbreakable life. In the years that followed, the story of the 900-day siege spread far beyond Russia's borders. In schools across Europe, in universities in America, and in small museums in Japan and Germany, people studied the siege as one of the most haunting examples of what humanity could both inflict and endure. Historians called it one of the darkest chapters of World War II, but survivors simply called it life. To them, it was not just a historical event, it was the sound of air raid sirens at dawn, the creak of frozen floorboards, the ache of an empty stomach, the bitter smell of smoke and snow. It was the story of how they refused to die. American journalists who visited Leningrad after the war wrote in disbelief about what they saw. One correspondent described the people as walking miracles, their faces lined with age and suffering, but their eyes burning with a strange kind of pride. U.S. soldiers, who had fought in Normandy or the Pacific, stood silent before the memorials when they visited decades later. They had faced combat, but not starvation. They had never known what it meant to fight a war without food, heat, or rest. It was a victory of the spirit, one American general would later say. No bomb, no army, no dictator could break them. In the years of the Cold War, when mistrust grew between East and West, the memory of Leningrad's ordeal became a rare bridge between enemies. American and Soviet veterans met at commemorative events, shaking hands not as rivals, but as survivors of the same storm. They shared photographs of comrades lost and stories of nights spent under fire. The language barrier mattered little. Suffering spoke its own dialect. And in those quiet meetings, often away from politics, they found something sacred, a mutual understanding that war, in its truest form, left no victors. As the 21st century dawned, the city, renamed St. Petersburg, was alive again. Its streets glowed with electric light, its theaters filled with music, and its cafes buzzed with laughter. Yet beneath that modern beauty lay invisible scars. Some old buildings still bore shrapnel marks hidden beneath fresh paint. In the suburbs, people still uncovered rusted shells and fragments of uniforms when digging foundations. Each discovery was a silent reminder of the time when death had stalked every street. In 2019, a new museum exhibition opened, using virtual reality to recreate a single day during the siege. Visitors put on headsets and found themselves standing in a ruined apartment as bombs fell outside, the glass trembling in the windows, the wind howling through cracks in the wall. The faint notes of Shostakovich's symphony played through the static, just as it had during that desperate summer of 1942. When the simulation ended, many emerged in tears. Some were too young to remember the Cold War, let alone the Second World War, but they felt, for a moment, the weight of what survival had meant. One of the guests at the opening was a frail woman in her late 90s. She had lived through the siege as a child. Her name was Ekaterina Smirnova, though everyone called her Katya. She was the same Katya who once huddled with her mother in that frozen apartment on Nevsky Prospect, who had eaten bread made with sawdust, who had walked across the frozen Neva, clutching her mother's hand. The city's mayor greeted her warmly, calling her a living symbol of courage. But Katya only smiled softly and said, "No, not courage, just hope." When the cameras left and the applause faded, Katya sat quietly by a window overlooking the river. Snow drifted gently outside, just as it had 77 years ago. She thought of her mother, of her father who had died on the front, of her neighbors who had vanished one by one. She thought of the hunger, the fear, and the sound of the first gunfire that had marked the beginning of it all. Yet as she looked at the city now, bright, alive, free, she felt a strange peace. The ghosts had not vanished, but they no longer haunted her. They watched over the city instead. That night, she wrote in her diary for the first time in years, "We survived not because we were stronger than death, but because we refused to forget what it meant to live. Leningrad is gone, but it lives in every heart that remembers what happened here. And as long as one child learns our story, we will never be truly gone." She passed away that winter, quietly in her sleep, her diary still open on the table beside her. When her grandchildren found it, they decided to donate it to the city museum. It became part of a permanent exhibit titled Voices of the Siege, displayed under glass beside hundreds of other diaries written by children, mothers, and soldiers. Every visitor who passed by would stop to read her final words, and many left with tears in their eyes. Outside the museum, the eternal flame still burned, undisturbed by wind or rain. Snow fell softly over the city once called Leningrad, blanketing the streets where once only ashes had lain. The people who lived there now walked freely, laughed openly, and dreamed boldly. The siege was long over, but its lesson endured, that no matter how long the night, the dawn will come, that no empire, no tyrant, no war can extinguish the light of a city that refuses to die. The winter sun rose slowly over the Neva, spilling pale gold across the frozen river and the domes of St. Isaac's Cathedral. The air was crisp, the city quiet, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. In that light, St. Petersburg shimmered, a city reborn from the ruins, its soul scarred but unbroken. Trams clattered along Nevsky Prospect, where once only sleds had carried the dead. Children played in the snow where soldiers had once stood guard with rifles. The laughter of the living mingled with the whispers of those long gone, carried softly by the wind that swept down from Lake Ladoga, the same wind that had once frozen tears to faces and turned bread into stone. Beneath the snow, beneath the pavement and the years, the bones of history rested quietly. They were the bones of mothers who refused to abandon their children, of soldiers who stood until their last breath, of strangers who shared their final crust of bread. The city had been a graveyard, a fortress, a beacon, and a miracle. It had endured famine, fire, disease, and the long shadow of despair. And still it had risen again. As evening fell, the bells of the Peter and Paul fortress tolled softly, echoing over the river. Lights flickered on across the skyline, reflecting off the ice like 1,000 tiny suns. The people walking home paused for a moment at the sound. Some bowed their heads. Others simply stood still and listened. They knew what the bells meant. They were not only a memorial, they were a promise that the city would remember. a promise that those who had suffered would not be forgotten. At the Piskaryovskoye Cemetery, where 500,000 victims of the siege lay buried beneath the snow, an old man placed a single red carnation at the base of the eternal flame. His coat was thin, his hands trembling, but his eyes were clear. He had been a boy during the siege, one of the countless children who had survived by miracle and will alone. Now he stood in silence, the flame's reflection dancing in his eyes. "We lived," he whispered. "That was our victory." The flame flickered gently in the breeze, its light never wavering. Above it, the sky deepened into violet, and then into black, studded with cold, distant stars. Somewhere far away, a train's whistle sounded, faint, mournful, almost like a memory. And in that sound was everything: the loss, the endurance, the hope. For 900 days, the city had been surrounded by death. For 900 nights, it had refused to surrender. And now, all these years later, its streets pulsed with life again. Lovers walked arm in arm along the embankments. Music drifted from open windows. The river that had once carried the dead now carried reflections of light. St. Petersburg breathed. It endured. It remembered. The ghosts of the siege were no longer cries in the dark, but quiet guardians of peace. Every candle lit, every song sung, every heartbeat echoed their defiance. The city that once starved now feasted on life itself. As the clock struck midnight, snow began to fall again. Soft, silent, endless. It covered the rooftops, the bridges, the memorials, and the graves. It covered the pain, the scars, and the stories, but it did not erase them. Beneath that blanket of white, the spirit of Leningrad, the city that would not die, slept peacefully, wrapped in memory. And the world, if only for a moment, seemed to bow in reverence to the courage of one city that endured the unthinkable and still found the strength to love, to live, and to hope again, and to hope again.